Hey Saints. Well, it's been a little bit of time here. I haven't had much to report on, but the last week and a half here, I actually had the super awesome privilege of being in Israel for the first time in my life. And it was a great trip. It was sponsored by the former church I used to go to. And they teamed up with a former professor, retired professor from Taylor University. His name was Dr. Larry uh, Hellier. And what I guess was neat about the trip was they had planned jam-packed every day to see every possible site. And although you were completely wiped by the end of each day, we sure got to see it, as much as you could see in 10 days. We were actually, just run ragged. But in terms of seeing the sites and getting great biblical teaching was just a fantastic trip. And along the way, and this is what led to this video, Dr. Hellier was recounting, David and Goliath and what happened there with Goliath of Gath. And I came up to him and I asked him afterwards, there's this weird thing in the Bible, weird, whatever, little fact that I said, why did David take Goliath's head back to Jerusalem, which is right here in 1 Samuel 17. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent, and I just thought that is really, was an odd account. Now, if you think about it, it would be decades later when David actually conquers Jerusalem and then turns it into the city of David, and then establishes the sort of the capital of the combined nation of Israel at that point. And so what's he doing here, going to what was at the time a Jebusite city, carrying the head of Goliath? And actually Dr. Hellier didn't have an answer to that one, and so I just was kind of guessing that maybe he was showing off something about having the head of Goliath to the Jebusites. And so I just got home here late Saturday night, and it was not till this morning that I had a chance to actually start to dig into this a little bit, and I ran into this great article here, Amazing Bible Timeline. They're trying to sell an integrated timeline of Bible history, but they had this great little part in here because I was looking up who were the Jebusites, trying to figure out why would David have gone there. Now, if you remember, David was born in Bethlehem, and so Jerusalem would have been, kind of the backdoor city to where he was born. And so I started thinking there's some little friction there between David in his youth and the Jebusites, was what was in my head. And so this was a great little encapsulation of all the verses where the Jebusites were mentioned. And so I was trying to figure out here, why would he have done this? Genesis 10, the first time the Jebusites appear in the Bible as one of the descendants of Canaan, right? And Ham's son there, he gets cursed, and that the curse actually appears to have led to, the Nephilim being in the land of Canaan. That is what appears. Then Joshua 10, the first time that Jerusalem was mentioned in the Bible, when its king Adonizedek led the Jebusites along with the people from the nearby cities to fight against Joshua, a war he eventually lost in which he was killed. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but Adonizedek was, a king of the Amorites, leading a coalition of 5 kings. And they were trying to come and attack. There was Gabal, the city that had signed a peace agreement with the Israelites, Joshua, when he had entered. And, these 5 kings wanted to destroy the Jews. when they came in, and so they were going to go, kill off the inhabitants of that city and the Jews with their coalition. Then we get some references in Joshua that the Jebusites dwell in the hill country. Well, I can attest to that. Jerusalem is definitely hilly. In Genesis 15, the Jebusites are listed as one of the clans that inhabit the land as promised to Abram. And so they're in sort of the promised land. In Exodus, God rescued the people of Moses from the Egyptians and brought them to the good and spacious land of milk and honey, where the Jebusites reside, along with 5 other tribes. Okay. God sent the angel to move out the 6 tribes, including the Jebusites, from the promised land. That happened in Exodus and Deuteronomy. God ordered the Israelites to completely destroy the Jebusites together with the other 6 mighty nations. And now here's the part that was in the list in Deuteronomy of the nations that they should utterly destroy. Men, women, children, whatever. But then there was a little problem. The Jebusites still live in Jerusalem with the Benjamites when it comes to Judges. So the Benjamites didn't utterly destroy them. They killed off that king, Adonizedek, in that battle, and killed off his army, but the inhabitants stayed in Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem was captured by the people of Judah. And in 15, Judah failed to expel the Jebusites, and they continued to live in the city with the children of Judah. And then in Judges, Jerusalem was also referenced as Jebus. That wasn't a big deal. The Jebusites protested against King David's arrival in Jerusalem, but David invaded Jerusalem, lived in its stronghold, and called it the City of David. And so there you get the final capturing of the city. And so I started digging into this. Well, who is this who is this king that was killed? Sorry. And then, why was this, one of those cities that completely had to be wiped off the face of the earth? And when you hear that list, and they were called the Amorite kings, the 5 that were in coalition that were going to come up and take the Israelites during the conquest in Joshua's time. And here I was just studying the Joshua 10 is where this Adonizedek has the coalition of people that came up against the Israelites. But in Amos 2, we figure out what these Amorite kings were all about. Here in Amos 2, this is a judgment against Israel, but he says here, "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorites in front of them, though their height seemed to be like a cedar, and their strength seemed to be like an oak, but whose fruit I destroyed from above, and roots from beneath." And so here, you get that reference that the Amorites were the Nephilim, they were the descendants of the Nephilim. They were the giants that were in the land. And there was those 7 then, I think it was total population groups that were considered the Canaanites. But the Amorites being sort of the lead, when they say the Amorites, you can almost say the consideration was, the Nephilim descendants, because the Amorites is sometimes used not only of a specific group within the land of Canaan, but to classify the group of the Nephilim that are in the land when it's being used. And that's, I think, the usage here is that, it's identifying that their height was like a cedar and their strength was like an oak. So that Adonizedek was one of the Amorite kings. So he was the king of, Jerusalem, the Jebusite city. He was an Amorite king that, David would have been super well aware of because he was in Bethlehem. And since, coming down to the time of David, Joshua's conquest, it was already like 400 years in the past. The only places that never got completely wiped out during Joshua's conquest was in the Gaza Strip. Think Goliath of Gath, right? That's Gath and is over there in the Gaza area. And then you would have had the Jebusites still living in the land, right? Because we learned that they weren't wiped out from Joshua's conquest. So it starts to make sense then that, these were the last vestiges of cities that, God had originally told Joshua, wipe them all out. And in this case, you sort of have a couple of places here in the Gaza Strip and then in the Jebusite-controlled Jerusalem where they hadn't been completely wiped out. And now look at what the problem was. And young David, then when he's fighting Goliath, I think later Goliath's brothers also were giants, were found in the land and wiped out by David's men, would sort of be David then as being, the guy that was finally fulfilling what was told to Joshua through Moses to wipe out, these giants that were in the land. God promised to chase them out of the land in front of him. Matter of fact, in the case of those 5 Amorite kings that I mentioned, Adonizedek leading that coalition, God rained hailstones down and it killed more of that coalition army in front of Israel than what Israel actually did with the sword. That was recorded in one of those accounts there. So I think that, is giving a lot more context for why did David feel like he had to trot the head of Goliath back to Jerusalem, which just seems to be crazy. It's because I think he grew up knowing that the Jebusites shouldn't be in the land. He grew up right next door in Bethlehem. David himself was the one that had to confront, or did confront, Goliath, one of the other last remaining, Nephilim descendants, if you want to use the title, an Amorite type king out of the Gaza area. And so when he killed him, it was proof that, that was a champion battle, right? Which means that they pick one person from each opposing army to fight a battle, and then whoever God is greatest, the thought was, would be the winner of that champion battle. Well, given David, maybe a 17-year-old kid at the time, killed Goliath, that meant David's God was greater than, the Jebusite God, or in the case of killing Goliath, the Philistines' God. And so by trotting his head back to Jerusalem, he was making a statement that, his God is greater, and there's proof he's got the head of, one of these last vestiges of the 7 Canaanite tribes in his hand. So I hope that's right. I think it's correct. At least gives me some notion of why did David kill Goliath, and his first thought is, I'm taking the head back to Jerusalem, which just seemed a little goofy when you read it in the passage. But I think with the rest of that context, that the Jebusites were one of the 7 Canaanite tribes that were told to completely, utterly destroy, and yet they hadn't been. That they were led by an Amorite king back in the day, and that Amorite king was very likely Nephilim. Matter of fact, I chased that down a little bit just so I wouldn't be, winging it here. I was pretty sure, because he was called an Amorite king, that he was Nephilim. But when you get into, I studied who were the, Jebusites, right? I took a look into that. Who is this Adonizedek? And I looked into that, and who are the 5 kings that they came up against, and all that type of thing. And then Zadok, where else was it? Extra biblical. The references, it's the recording of Zadok appears in a bunch of places, but they were born from the Wanderers or the Titans, right? Who are the Titans? The demigods. So there you go again, descendants of the Nephilim, right? The Titans were the product of angels mating with human women back in, I guess that would be Greek lore, but I mean, it goes back through ancient history. And then Zadok was described as the father then of, two of these other demigods who were listed. And so that gives us some more context. Zadok's God was, recognized as the worship of the planet Jupiter. And so all of these, if you want to say demigods, were supposedly having their representation in the planets, right? You got Saturn worship for Satan, and here we see Zadok was, Jupiter worship, and I think was Jupiter the war god. But they're, what they're worshiping the fallen angels that, the Watchers were over the 69 of the 70 tribes of the earth at the Tower of Babel. I think you get that out of Exodus. I want to say it's 23, something like that. But God chose, a people for himself and called Abraham out to have a people for himself. And so the other 69 tribes at the time were in control of the Watcher angels who transgressed, right? You got the angels sleeping with the daughters of men in Genesis 6, producing these giants. And so here the story repeats where, the Zadok is tied to the worship of Jupiter, and that, he's a descendant of the Titans, right? He's a descendant of the Nephilim. So I hope that's interesting for you, saints. God bless. I can honestly report that the land of Israel was in full bloom. The locals talked about it as feeling sort of like late spring. The summer was at the door. Everything was greened up, even the hillsides and all that were very green, but the weather was turning hot, and they said that it's probably got one more week before a lot of the grass and the hillsides and all that and the flowers actually die because of the heat and the drought, or the arid conditions. And so I can't confirm that the barley was in Abib, but it sure likely was, based on what I saw. And I did have the blessing of seeing a fig tree along the way, and yep, its leaves were bursting forth here in the spring, which is kind of fun because you think about Matthew, saying that when you see the fig tree, shooting forth its leaves, know that the summer is nigh. Well, that's exactly what was in my head when I saw it. So God bless. Maybe this Passover, who knows, saints, the timing is all in the Lord's hands. It just keep looking up. God bless.